Now, despite its very Indian terms of reference, this couplet is not at all an unusual one in the genre of Urdu and Persian poetry. Similar couplets would and could have been written in Iran, which had a Zoroastrian reference, and in the Ottoman Empire, which had a Christian reference. In India, they had a Hindu reference. The couplet could say one of two things. Perhaps that all religions are equally true, or conversely, that all religions are equally false, and that there is a higher wisdom that the poet aspires towards. But what interests me about this typical, if somewhat audacious couplet, is the role that the word Islam plays in it. There are three terms, Deen, Mazhab, and Islam, invoked in the couplet. These are not synonyms. Deen generally means religion, roughly speaking religion. Mazhab, a kind of school of law. And Islam, which today we think of as the container for everything else, like Deen or Mazhab, in the couplet actually refers only to the most particularistic of mostly ritual practices, which is why it is sitting in a temple and daubing sandalwood paste on your forehead that gets to be, in Mir's couplet, the equivalent of Islam. So whereas we tend to think of Islam today as a universal category under which all ritual, conceptual, theological, philosophical, and other elements might be gathered, for Mir, as for everyone living in India and in the Muslim world, if you can use that term for that time, it would have meant something quite different. Islam is a term that appears very rarely in the Quran itself, maybe 3 times as al-Islam, and not so plentifully in the few centuries that follow the Quran. Deen is by far a more popular word, and it is a word that can be used for Christians and Jews and perhaps other religious groups as well. Yet, by the time, 40 years after Mir's death, that another poet then residing in this city, Delhi, Altaf Hussain Hali, wrote his famous epic poem, the Musaddas Dar Mad Jazra Islam, a Musaddas on the flow and ebb of Islam. Islam had replaced Deen and Mazhab and every other kind of category that we normally place today under Islam, and become a subject in its own right. And in a way, the story I want to tell is how and why Islam came to be what it became and what it remains to some degree today. What happened in modern history, that Islam, which in the Quran was and is grammatically a verbal noun that describes a set of practices, like ritual practices, such as sitting in a temple and daubing your forehead with sandalwood paste. What happened that Islam, as this very particular reference, comes to be transformed into the name of a religion, into the name of something that claims universality for itself? From an action, from a word that describes a set of actions, it became a proper name. Now, what I want to suggest, and what indeed I argue in my book, is that Islam comes to be this form of global subject only from around the middle of the 19th century, in a context marked by colonial rule and the decline of traditional forms of authority, both royal authority, political authority in Muslim societies, as well as religious authorities. So rather than colonialism and its culture resulting in the diminution of Islamic identity, the opposite happens. Islam comes to be a word that names any number of actions, beliefs, practices, understandings, conceptualizations. And it does so precisely by diminishing kings, clerics, and mystics. These kings, clerics, and mystics had in the past mediated religious belief and authority through their persons or their institutional repertoires. You would go to a dargah, a Sufi dargah, for intercession. The king might, in your view, represent the shadow of God on earth and perform the task of representing divine justice on earth. The cleric protected your religion, and many other forms of religious and political authority in between these three that I've mentioned might also have existed at different times and places in India as in other parts of the world. With the emergence of colonial societies in Asia and Africa and the Middle East, and the decline of these traditional forms of authority, what you have happening is the coming to be of Islam as a new kind of authority, which can no longer be owned by any of these earlier versions and figures I've mentioned. So Islam becomes a protagonist in its own right and becomes a figure in and of history. And you can see this in Hali's poem, which becomes the most famous Urdu poem indeed the most famous Urdu literary work of the entire 19th century. So whereas the title of his poem, The Flow and Ebb of Islam, suggests a maritime metaphor, when you actually read it in the poem, Islam is a subject. It's a historical subject, it's an agent, it does things, it wants you to do things, it wants you to believe things. It works in its own right. Now, I think you can already guess that Islam performs this kind of work, is expanded into this capacious subjecthood. These things can only happen with the diminution and decline of, if you will, real forms of institutional and personal authority. And this is how the expansiveness of Islam, understood conceptually, is actually twinned with, or rather caused by, influenced by, the rise of colonial rule in many parts of the world. Now, when this happens, Islam has itself to be redefined. It is initially defined as a civilization, a category very important in imperial understandings of non-Western societies. And it's as a civilization that the Muslims, so-called reformers of the 19th century, whom we often call modernists or liberals, tended to understand Islam. By the middle of the 20th century, with the rise of Islamism, or what we used to call fundamentalism, Islam is understood differently as an ideology. This, of course, makes perfect sense during the Cold War, in which ideological states and revolutions are all the rage in many parts of the world. And towards the end of the 20th century, and into the early years of the 21st, Islam comes to be understood by other Muslims as a kind of identity. This is in the post-Cold War period, when you no longer have revolutions and ideological states enjoying much popularity in social and political terms around the globe, but you have instead the rise of what is called identity politics, and Islam comes to be that kind of identity. So if you will, the civilizational version of Islam broadly corresponds to a liberal imperial framework, The ideological form of Islam broadly corresponds to a Cold War context, and the identitarian form of Islam broadly corresponds to a post-Cold War neoliberal context. Of course, there are many ways in which you can understand Islam, either civilizationally or ideologically or as a form of identity. But what I want to do is focus on three ways in which Islam is understood in this manner. Now, when Islam comes to be understood either as a civilization or ideology or an identity, it of course partakes these forms of belonging with other kinds of movements around the world. There's nothing particularly unique about Muslims or Islam in this respect. What interests me, however, is how when Islam comes to be refashioned in these three ways, it tends to problematize each one of these ways of thinking about Islam, tends to problematize either theology or politics or indeed human agency and selfhood. So let me go on then to describe three ways in which Islam is refashioned in these ways that I'm suggesting, and how each one may illustrate the problematization of theology first, politics second, and selfhood or human agency third. So let me begin with a genre of Muslim protest and mobilization that should be familiar to all of us, not just here in India or South Asia, but in many other parts of the world. And that is to say, mobilizations over insults allegedly delivered the Prophet. Now, I want to place these forms of mobilization under a particular historical shift, which is the move from Mohammedanism to Islam. Mohammedanism, of course, is a European term, and it defines Islam, what we call Islam, in terms of Christianity. That is to say, Islam is understood as a religion named after its founding figure. And for many decades, it's a 19th century term largely, for many decades, Muslims seem to have no trouble with this at all. Think about the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, later Aligarh Muslim University. Of course, this was an English word, an English term, but the same is true for terms in Urdu or Persian or Arabic. Muhammadiyah or Muhammadi, these are commonplace terms in the 19th century. It's only in the latter part of that century that Muslims start questioning this usage of Muhammadan. And it's an interesting thing that happens there, because at the very moment when they seem to displace or want to displace the role of Muhammad in the definition of Islam, by saying that Muhammad is not Islam's founder, that Islam not only pre-exists Muhammad, but actually is the true agent of history for Muslims. At the very moment they do this, Muhammad becomes vulnerable and requires protection and defense in a way that he may not have needed in the past. So the shift from Mohammedanism to Islam, while notionally one that sought to give Islam or understand Islam as a proper name, it is Islam that Muslims believe in, it is Islam that acts in the world, it is Islam that defines what Muslims do, not Muhammad. At the very moment this happens, Muhammad becomes a site of extreme anxiety for Muslims. And one of the ways in which this anxiety is demonstrated is through mobilizations over perceived insults to Muhammad. Now, of course, there were insults allegedly delivered against the Prophet that pre-existed colonial times, but the kinds of mobilizations we are familiar with first begin in the very middle of the 19th century, and indeed in India. So I want to talk briefly about two riots, the riots of 1850 and the riots of 1874, both in the city of Bombay as it then was known. These are not Hindu-Muslim riots, which is what we tend to expect, but Parsi Muslim riots. They are Parsi Muslim riots not only because of the very important economic, political, and demographic place that Parsis occupied in mid-19th century Bombay, but precisely because these riots and the way in which they were defined had to do with the making of a new colonial and capitalist society in the city of Bombay. So whereas in parts such as this, in northern India, you had religious and theological disputations in which someone might write a polemical piece, say refuting Muhammad's doctrines, and a Muslim cleric might respond with a similar piece, and there would be a kind of ongoing argument in writing, in print, or indeed in munazaras, in debates. In these two riots that occur in Bombay in the middle of the 19th century, you have absolutely no theological pretext. If you will, the religious language that we take as definitive of riots and communal riots as they are known, or religious disputations, is missing. And this is what really sets a new standard in the mobilization of Muslims against perceived insults to their prophet. So what happens in Bombay? In both cases, you have Parsi-owned newspapers, one a newspaper, one a kind of booklet, published in Gujarati, one of which is understood as printing an image of Muhammad that is objected to not because it is an image, but because it has been somehow printed in such a way as to mark the face of the Prophet. And the other, a booklet claiming to tell the story of Muhammad's life, focusing on the sexual part of it. Certain groups of Muslims in the city are unhappy with these publications. Interestingly, none of them can read Gujarati. These are Muslims either from this part of the country, from North India, or they are Arab boatmen from the Gulf, or Siddhi from the western coast of India, some of whom will be Gujarati speakers. Mostly they are not. The Gujarati-speaking Muslims side with the Parsis, who are their partners in commerce and trade in Bombay. The Shias do not take part, the Sunnis. So there is no such thing as a uniform Muslim community in either of these riots. It's split in various ways. Hindu lower castes also participate in the riots on the side of the Muslim rioters. So it's actually very difficult to, as it were, communalize this situation. It's much more complicated. And in fact, it has as much to do with, if you will, class warfare as anything else, because it's people at the bottom of society who are protesting and rioting, and people at the top of society who are defending. Now, why do I mention these two riots? I do because the terms in which they come to be understood go on to define all subsequent mobilizations against alleged insults to the Prophet, not just in India, but globally, starting at least with the Rushdie affair in 1989. And I mention Bombay's role or status as a great center of finance and capital in India, because it is this role and status that defines the language of Muslim protest, in which the theological element, as we shall see, is missing. So, what are Muslims protesting? Either they say that the circulation of mischaracterizations as they see them of the Prophet's image or his sexual life should be banned, in which case the Prophet and his life are understood as the property of Muslims, whose circulation is or should be illicit. This becomes a question of copyright and is spoken of as such. Or they argue that they are identified with the Prophet or members of his family in such a way that an insult to the Prophet ends up being an insult to them. In this sense, it is libel or defamation that defines Muslim complaints. So either you have property and copyright or identification and libel, providing the vocabulary of Muslim protest. Blasphemy, which we tend to think of as defining these protests, is absent. It's absent from the Muslim discourse. It is present in the British discourse. Because, of course, Britain continues to have a blasphemy law until it was abolished by Tony Blair in the aftermath of the Rushdie affair. At most, Muslims much later, during the Rushdie affair, asked to be included under the Christian blasphemy law. Though Islam has a very substantial and complicated understanding of what we might call blasphemy, none of its terms of reference are ever mentioned by any Muslims, either in 1850 or 1874 or indeed much later, which is why these Bombay riots really proved to be definitive. It's one way in which, perhaps an unfortunate way in which, India becomes the source of Islam's globalization. Because, of course, the Rushdie affair and the mobilizations it provoked began in India and Pakistan and then moved on to the United Kingdom amongst immigrant communities from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh before they went global in the rest of the Muslim world. So when we think about the language of Muslim protest, what we see very appropriate for a city like Bombay is a language dominated by understandings and arguments about free trade and protectionism. Should the circulation of the Prophet's image or biography be restricted, or in order to protect Muslim sensitivities, or should they be permitted? Is the Prophet and his career the property of Muslims, or are they so identified with him that insulting Muhammad ends up meaning the same thing as insulting them? Both of these kinds of arguments are made then, and they continue to be made much later. By the time the 1874 riots occur, you have in place already the Indian Penal Code, of which Lord Macaulay is the crucial author. In that penal code, the blasphemy provision, which continues to exist in Britain, is removed, and it is replaced by a provision that is taken from Jeremy Bentham's philosophy of utilitarianism, in particular his notion of the principle of harms. And the language of this particular section of the Indian Penal Code, which still exists in India, Pakistan, and I imagine Bangladesh, refers not to blasphemy at all, but to the offense of sentiments, the hurting of sentiments. This term, of course, should be familiar to us all because it continues to be used in law and in popular debate to this day across South Asia. So from 1874 onwards, Muslims latch on to this phrase. Our sentiments have been hurt. Not only Muslims, of course, other religious groups do as well. What Macaulay's law had sought to do was conflate blasphemy, remove the theological element of it, and conflate it with defamation and libel. And it indeed, that section of it belongs in a list of other such provisions which deal with various kinds of offenses. And so when Muslims or indeed other religious groups make claims about their sentiments being hurt, they are quoting directly from the Indian Penal Code, but also making claims universally, not just for themselves. So in every case, Muslim protesters will say, it is not only our religion that should be protected, it's everyone's religion that should be protected. And in doing so, of course, they are working in the spirit of the Indian Penal Code itself, which has universalized blasphemy into something altogether different. So here too, you see the interesting absence of any theological element in this reputedly an entirely religious set of disputes. So what does it mean for a dispute to be religious while at the same time lacking a theological element? That is the problem that characterizes all such controversies over insults to the Prophet from the 19th century until today. So if you will, the Indian Penal Code comes to define, if you will, a kind of secular form of outrage. But here you see something quite strange happening. Because there is a gap between the Muslim reasoning and argumentation seeking to protect the Prophet from insult and injury, on the one hand, and the sheer passion and sometimes violence that occasionally characterizes these mobilizations. There seems to be no connection at all between the perfectly rationalistic argument that the Prophet is our property and slanders against him should not circulate because we have copyright over him, or that we are so identified with him that any insult to him is an insult to us. You may believe these arguments or you may not, but they are banal arguments. How do you move from this set of arguments, with its entire lack of theological characteristics, to riots, passion, and violence? I think it is precisely because what is missing in them is a theological element. It is almost as if the violence recurses and seeks to produce what remains absent in the argument made by these particular Muslims protesting against insults to the Prophet. And I say this because there is no effort to rehearse or to dig out of the Muslim tradition itself the rich categories of imprecations. On the contrary, when reference to blasphemy is made, it is always to Christian ideas of blasphemy. In more recent years, you have a curious situation in which this language of protest seems to have collapsed under its own weight. So when Imran Khan was Prime Minister of Pakistan, he, along with his, just following the route of his predecessors, tried to internationalize Muslim arguments against insulting the Prophet, and not only the Prophet, insulting anyone's religious founding figures or figures of reverence. He did so at the United Nations in New York. He did so in Pakistan. He did so on television. He did so privately. He did so in correspondence with Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. But he seems to have realized that the old set of arguments no longer sufficed. And so he replaced Christian blasphemy with the Holocaust by saying that just as Jews were right to demand the banning of any approbation of the Holocaust, so too Muslims on the same model were right to demand that their feelings be protected from insults delivered to the Prophet. Now, of course, this is in some ways a perfectly bizarre comparison to make. And I think one reason why it was made was precisely because the unavailability of the theological element could no longer be sustained by the invocation of Christian blasphemy. It had to reach out to something else in a secularized world where blasphemy no longer made sense. So it had to be, if you will, the secular form of blasphemy, which was the denial of genocide. Now, I'll move on from this issue very soon, but I describe these two riots and the pattern they set in the vocabulary of Muslim protests in order to show how Muhammad was not just rendered vulnerable by the rise of Islam as the true subject of Muslim history. Muhammad therefore had to be protected, but also that his protection could no longer depend upon any traditional form of Muslim authority or indeed any theological argumentation. It was, if you will, perversely secularized. So that's one way in which you can understand the consequences of the rise of Islam as a global subject. I want to move on to another one. And this has to do with how Allah has been replaced by Islam. So first, recall, I described how Mohammedanism was replaced by Islam and what that meant, what the implications of that were. Now I want to say something about how Allah, God, the name of God, has been displaced in popularity in Muslim texts by the term Islam. Islam has taken over God's role in so many ways. This is not something I came up with. A very famous historian whose early work was in India, in late colonial times, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, notes this already. That whereas in the Quran, Allah, the word Allah, outnumbers the term Islam in, right, over 1,000%. In modern times, he notes, we are in a reverse position. When you look at modern Muslim texts, Islam is a more popular term than God's name. How does this happen? What does it mean? It too means that it's the rise of Islam as an uninstitutionalized, impersonal subject that depends upon the evisceration of traditional forms of Muslim authority undoes not just the theological element that I described just now when talking about insults to the Prophet, but the political element in Muslim society. And I want to spend a bit of time describing what I mean by that. So, when we look at 19th century, mid to late 19th century and 20th century Muslim accounts of history and of politics, we see the sudden, especially of Islamist texts, or within Islamist texts, you see the extraordinary rise of idolatry as a term. But idolatry no longer refers to actual idols, statues in temples, or things like that. Idolatry now comes largely to refer to abstract agents and ideologies. So, democracy might be idolatrous, monarchy might be idolatrous, nationalism might be idolatrous. Right? These are all understood by Islamist thinkers as idols because they take the place of God. That the ultimate authority and ultimate value is now defined not by God, but by these ideological and political forms. This indeed has become the commonplace way in which idolatry comes to be understood. So the old-fashioned idols, statues in temples, are no longer really important for Muslim discourse. Right? It is nationalism or communism or monarchy or even democracy that is understood as being idolatrous. And I suspect the idol has returned to Muslim discourse from the late 19th century to the early 20th, perhaps more in the 20th century, in part because God has disappeared from this language. Now, let me say something about how this happens by talking about sovereignty. So, Islamists are well known, at least the most important ones, for decrying sovereignty. Now, this might surprise you because, of course, Asian and African countries, especially former colonies, we tend to think of as being desirous of recovering sovereignty and of maintaining sovereignty, because colonialism is understood as being the deprivation of sovereignty. So how is it that Islamist thinkers criticize sovereignty? Well, there are many ways in which you can legitimately, intellectually criticize sovereignty as being tyrannical, potentially at least, as being unnecessary if you're an anarchist, for instance. So Islamists are not the only ones who have critiques of sovereignty. But let me give you two Islamist critiques of sovereignty to illustrate this point I'm making about God's absence from Muslim debate. And the first is that propounded by perhaps the most famous Islamist thinker, Abul Ala Maududi, born and brought up in the city of Hyderabad in this country, in the Deccan, who moves to Pakistan after partition and is famously the founder of the Jamaat-e-Islami, both in this country and in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and in other parts of the world. So Maududi already in the 1930s has a very interesting view of sovereignty. He says, and he cites people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. He says, when you look at the European understanding of sovereignty, what you see is a power that is so absolute and unitary as to belong only to God. That no one, no human person or assembly can possibly manifest in itself the kind of sovereignty that is theorized by European scholars such as Hobbes and Jean Baudin. And if they try to do so, they necessarily fall short. And in falling short of expressing this form of unitary and absolute sovereignty, they bring into being despotism, dictatorship, and tyranny. So it is not that the sovereign is so powerful and strong as to impose dictatorship and tyranny and despotism upon society, but rather the failure of the sovereign to exercise power is what opens any society up to tyranny, despotism, and dictatorship. Right? So it's actually quite an interesting argument. Sovereignty is so unitary and absolute in theory that it can only belong to God. If human beings try to exercise it, they will only open up their societies to misuse, to tyranny and despotism. And therefore, what we must do, Maududi argues, is to expel sovereignty along with God himself. Right? Sovereignty belongs to God. What that means is that human beings cannot exercise it. In effect, what he's saying is that God does not have a role to play in our society. People like Maududi himself and other Muslim authorities might tinker with an already existing legal corpus, Sharia, but they can do no more than that in this argument. Now, this theory could be understood anarchistically. If you remove sovereignty, then what you have is society managing itself through a law that is inherent within it. It could be understood even in Leninist terms, insofar as Lenin foresaw the withering away of the state and the self-management of society, the anarchist element within communism. And indeed, Maududi is familiar with Lenin and he's familiar with these writings as well. But the way in which this theory manifests itself in a place like Pakistan is really quite interesting. So what Maududi's ideas come to define Pakistani constitutionalism, at least its preamble. In all three iterations of the Pakistani constitution, sovereignty is denied, not claimed. It belongs to God. Human beings cannot exercise it. It might be somehow delegated to the people of Pakistan, but must be managed from the outside. The scholars who are meant to define or manage Sharia by tinkering with it exist not within the state, but outside the state. So they are meant to represent society running itself. Again, echoes of anarchism here. What results is perhaps devastating. It is precisely in a constitutional structure which lacks sovereignty that, if you will, sovereignty comes back in its most brutal, dictatorial, and tyrannical form in the military coup. So when you try to exclude it altogether, the ghost of sovereignty returns over and over again. It is almost as if the Pakistani constitution sets it up to be so. Now, I'm not making a causal argument here. I'm not saying because the constitution is written in such and such a way, this is why military coups happen in Pakistan. No. Obviously, military coups happen because of political circumstances and, different weightages of interests and the like. What I am saying is that the language of the constitution, which comes out of Maududi's theorization of sovereignty, is able to grasp what happens in that country in its own terms. So all military coups in Pakistan are indeed defined by the so-called doctrine of necessity and legitimized after the fact by its Supreme Court. So Pakistan, as you know, is the world's first Islamic republic, and it sets in place this way of thinking about sovereignty in which, rather than God ruling that state, it is God's absence that defines it. And it is the military coup that, as it were, represents a divine miracle that shatters that state. When we look at the world's second Islamic republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, you have a quite different understanding of sovereignty. And yet, it works out in much the same way. So there we have Khomeini. And Khomeini does want sovereignty. He wants to claim sovereignty. And he does. But he ends up doing so not in the name of Islam, but in the name of non-Islam. And I'll describe how. So in his famous text, the Vilayat-e-Faqih, Khomeini sets up a kind of structure, right, of functions. The Prophet is reduced to a function, the Imams are reduced to various kinds of functions that anyone can exercise. So unlike in this moment I was describing, in which Muslims are so identified with the Prophet that they feel insulted when others insult him, for Khomeini, the Prophet has been reduced to a pure function. Anyone can exercise that role. Just so with the Imams and other figures. You can have a traditional relationship with the Prophet and the Imams in esoteric terms, as part of inner life. But in terms of the constitution and the state and politics, he has in a way secularized it. Islam works as a kind of machine. So what happens with sovereignty there? There's a famous instance in which the current supreme leader, who was then the Friday prayer leader in Tehran, makes a speech during the Friday prayers where he says much the same thing as Khomeini says. Sovereignty belongs to God. We can't really do anything about it except tinker along the edges according to Islamic law, which allows society to manage and run itself. Khomeini, the very next day, refutes him in public and says, no, you're wrong. If this was the case, then why do we even need the Prophet? The Prophet's role has to be present in our own day, or else we might as well be a secular republic. Now, what he meant by that was not that anyone could take on the role of the Prophet apart from in the functional way I described, but rather that sovereignty could only be exercised by the Islamic Republic in defiance of the Sharia itself. So his argument is the following. Sharia represents divine law, there's no doubt of that. But sometimes, in order to answer the welfarist requirements of the Iranian state, you need to suspend this law. So notice the difference between the kind of European understanding of sovereignty as theorized by the German jurist Carl Schmitt. What Carl Schmitt argues is that sovereignty is the law of exception, that you have a welfarist law in place, and at times of emergency, it can and should be suspended by the sovereign. This is where sovereignty resides, in the suspension of the law, so that the emergency can be managed. For Khomeini, it's exactly the opposite. Islamic law exists, and sovereignty is there to suspend Islamic law, not for an emergency, but for everyday welfare causes. So the example he gives are labor laws, that traditional Islamic law may not favor collective negotiation with unions, but Khomeini wanted it, and therefore you can actually suspend Sharia for this to happen. Khomeini suspends Sharia all the time in his career. Right? He has the authority to do so. And he says, look, anything can be suspended. All the 5 pillars of Islam, you can suspend the Hajj, the pilgrimage, you can suspend the 5 prayers or the 3 prayers for Shiites, you can suspend the zakat, the alms, you can suspend all the major articles of Islam. And indeed, he goes on to say that the people of Iran during the time of revolution were better than the Muslims in the time of Muhammad himself and in the time of the Shiite Imams. Of course, he can say that precisely because, and like Maududi in this respect, God has absented himself from his world. it is faith in the unseen that, for Khomeini, defines the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Not because they have God with them, but because they don't. They believe in a God whom they cannot see and who doesn't act in their world. So, if you will, in a different way, Khomeini comes down to a similar conclusion as Maududi. So, if with disputes over the Prophet, you have the problem of the lack or loss of theology, with the Islamist arguments over sovereignty and how it belongs to God, you have the absence of God as something that prefigures it, as well as the problem of politics itself. For Maududi especially, how do you do politics without sovereignty? So in my final example, I want to move to the way in which the figure of the Muslim itself has been replaced by Islam. So recall, my first illustration was about how Mohammedanism was replaced by Islam. The second was how Allah or God was replaced by Islam as the real subject of Muslim history, with no institutions, which can be claimed by almost everyone. And the third, therefore, is how the figure of the Muslim, him or herself, has been replaced by Islam as the true subject of history. And this has to do with agency without mediation. So remember that I had described the decline and diminution of traditional forms of Muslim authority in colonial times by making the case that Muslims suddenly started criticizing their Sufi saints or their clerics or their princes and kings, whom they blamed for the colonization of their societies. And they blamed them for this colonization by arguing largely that these figures were too reliant on a politics of mediation, that they claimed some kind of divine status for themselves because ordinary Muslims had to go through the cleric or through the Sufi saint or through the king to have any access to God or to have any access to their own religion. So reformist Islam, whether it is modernist and wants to conceive of Islam as a civilization, or whether it is Islamist and wants to consider Islam as an ideology, sought to undo the authority of these older figures on the grounds that mediation was impermissible, that their mediation is what led to Islam's decline, that they took the place of God, literally, that they disallowed ordinary Muslims any access to divine authority. And I think we have seen in the two illustrations I've given you so far how this critique of mediation works itself out in terms of the absence of the theological element and the absence, if you will, of the political element from certain debates about Islam. The problem with getting rid of mediation, of course, is that the ordinary Muslim individual is then put face to face with divine authority, him or herself. And what this results in is a kind of deep anxiety over the ordinary Muslim's agency as well. So it's not just the kings or the clerics or the Sufi saints who are condemned, but now ordinary Muslims must also look suspiciously upon the agency they reputedly rob from God. So I want to end my lecture by discussing how this anxiety manifests itself first in Al-Qaeda, then in ISIS. So I want to look at the rise of militancy in the early 21st century and in a neoliberal context where identity is what defines who you are. So you will no doubt be familiar with the argumentation of Al-Qaeda, which basically can be defined as a form of mirroring. It's a very simple form of argumentation, which says, if you kill our women, children, and civilians, we kill yours. If you do X, we do Y. It's a relationship of reflection, of mirroring, that the militants of Al-Qaeda had or have with their enemy. It's a very intimate relationship. And when you look at the writings and speeches of bin Laden and Zawahiri and others, you see that they are marked by the intense familiarity with the enemy. So unlike Western understandings of Al-Qaeda, which are all about how foreign and alien these people are, Muslim militant understandings of the West are completely the reverse. We know them well, we understand them perfectly, we even quite like them on occasion. And all we are doing is reflecting to them what they are doing to us. Right? This is the structure of the argument. It's one defined by intimacy. And one reason why mirroring serves as the great argument for Al-Qaeda's militants is in order to allow them to disclaim any personal sovereignty or agency of their own. What we are doing is not what we are doing. All we are doing is showing you the mirror. It is you who is acting. We, in fact, are not. We are simply reacting. We make no claim. We have no ontology. It's a curiously negative subjecthood that is invoked there. The iconic figure of Al-Qaeda's militancy, of course, is the suicide bomber. A person who dies while killing. The moment he exercises agency in killing, he must also absolve himself from it by dying. It's the ultimate form of the mirroring act, where you die alongside your own victims. And the suicide bomber, of course, in his, mostly their men, video testaments and all the rest, employed a rhetoric of sacrifice. We are sorry to do this. We wish we couldn't. We wish we didn't need to do this, but circumstances are such that we must do this, and so we kill and we die. Now think about ISIS. The Islamic State's militants do not deploy a logic of mirroring. What mirroring as exists is truncated. So I'm thinking of, for instance, Jim Foley, the American journalist who was captured and then executed on video. Before executing him, they dressed him in these orange overalls of the kind that are worn by American prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and they waterboarded him just like American prisoners are in Guantanamo Bay, but there was no reason for either of these things, right? So people are dressed in orange in Guantanamo Bay so they can be easily seen in case they try to escape, notionally. And they're waterboarded, apparently, to extract information from them. Neither of these two things was necessary for Jim Foley. It was just an act of reflection and mimicry that was going on, but it was incomplete. Right? That's all that happened there. What happens with ISIS, rather, is the replacement of the logic of mirroring and of sacrifice with that of virtuality and pleasure. Unlike Al-Qaeda, whose enemy was the West, the enemy most important for the Islamic State militants was Iran and Shiism in general. Indeed, if there is any act of mirroring, it is with the Shia. So it's a sectarian language that's turned inwards. The caliph appointed by the Islamic State, bin Laden and company never claimed the caliphate. but the Islamic State claims it and appoints one, is simply a mirror image of the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution. The Sahaba or companions of the Prophet, who are much lauded by the Islamic State, are simply mirror images of the Imams of the Shia, who are their true enemy. Right? The Shia in Iran are not the true enemies of the Islamic State merely because they happen to be Shia, but because the Shia represent, for them, a version of sovereignty and agency exercised in inner life. The supposedly secretive nature of Shiism, which can pretend to acknowledge certain kinds of identities and practices while secretly disclaiming them. Right? A doctrine called taqiyya. So it is not Shiism as such, it is the very idea of human agency and therefore of human sovereignty that is the issue with the Islamic State. With Al-Qaeda, that form of sovereignty or agency is exercised in the moment of killing through dying. With ISIS, you get rid of the suicide bomber as an iconic figure, and there are fewer and fewer of them, and of the language of sacrifice. What you have instead is the language of total transparency, where the militant subject is constantly having to expose himself in approving all his actions in their own right without deriving them from the language of his enemy. The militant figure in the Islamic State, therefore, becomes a virtual subject, not the suicide bomber's testament, but these elaborately staged spectacles in which people are often tortured or killed and monuments destroyed on video, in which the people doing the killing and the destruction are depicted as enjoying what they're doing. So unlike the Al-Qaeda figure, who is despondent and sad at what he's meant to be doing and sacrifices himself, the ISIS figure is meant to enjoy what he's doing and is meant to perform and turn his destruction into a spectacle. And I would like to speculate that this is the way in which not just the suspect sovereignty of human agency, but the inner life of the human individual subject itself is eviscerated. That what is created is a totally flat subject, totally transparent, with no inwardness, and absolutely understood as enjoying and taking pleasure in the performance of the law, or what is taken to be law in the Islamic State. So I've given you 3 illustrations of the implications, of some implications, all of which are rather negative, but these are not the only ones that exist. I've just focused on these. 3 illustrations of the implications of Islam's emergence as a global subject in its own right, without institutional bases, without traditional authority. Islam understood in such a way as to minoritize all traditional forms of authority, and with them the theological and political and other forms that had previously defined such forms of authority. So I spoke about insults to the Prophet. I spoke about the question and problem of sovereignty in Islamist thought. And I spoke about the shift from Al-Qaeda to ISIS in 21st century militancy. I hope I'm right in thinking that the first of these illustrations belongs to the world of, if you will, liberal imperialism. The second belongs in the world of the Cold War with its ideological states and its debates on sovereignty. And the third belongs in the post-Cold War world of neoliberalism with its focus on identity and the individual. What I'd like to end with is the title of my book itself. Olga has a copy there. It's called Waning, Crescent, The Rise and Fall of Global Islam. I had wanted to call this book The End of Islam, but my agent was not, my editor, I should say, was not happy with that choice. The reason I wanted to call it The End of Islam was because all of these versions of Muslim mobilization and argumentation I've been describing emerge out of and depend upon history or a historical understanding of the world. So Islam is understood as a subject in its own right. It acts, it wants, it does things, but it can only be a subject in history or in historical terms. The problem with being a subject in and of history is that if you are born historically, you also can die historically. Death and endings are an inevitable part of all histories. Once Islam was made into a historical subject, therefore, the idea of its end was built into its idea. Which is one reason why Muslims who subscribe to this understanding of Islam, and not everyone did. Remember, I have looked only at the modernists, the Islamists, and these 21st century militants. I'm not looking at Sufis, I'm not even looking at clerics, to say nothing of many other Muslims. So the reason why I wanted to use the term The End of Islam for my title is because I was fascinated at how, from the middle of the 19th century, Muslim thinkers, having turned Islam into a subject in and of history, were forced to or compelled to imagine its end. And they imagine its end not in apocalyptic terms. That is to say, God does something and things come to an end. They imagine this ending in historical terms. Just as Islam arose in history, so too it might decline in history. This is commonplace in anyone who thinks historically, when you think about any subject in history. And I was absolutely fascinated by these understandings of Islamic decline, built in, as I said, to the very making of Islam into a subject. So I told my editor, look, by end, I mean not only a finishing off or a completion, but also a goal. An end can also be a goal. You can have an end in view. And the two things go together. Because Muslim thinkers of the kind I've described not only feared the end of Islam as in its decline, but also had an end in mind, a goal in mind, that Islam it needed to manifest its subjectivity. It needed to act in the world. Except, of course, as the kind of subject it had become, it had no institutional or other bases. It was simply a narrative that could be fought over and claimed by many people, anyone. Its very universality, its very global nature, disallowed it from having either a theological set of particularities or indeed political set of particularities attached to it. And it is the problem created by this kind of globalization that is the problem my book explores. Now, as I said, what I presented to you today are three rather extreme illustrations of Islam understood in this manner. But I think it's important to focus on them not only because they are controversial, but because you have to attend, I think, primarily to the controversial first in order to understand the rest. That is also how I wrote my book on Gandhi. I focused on all the bits of Gandhi that are uncomfortable and that people don't like to look at. But I believed that it is only by looking at Gandhi in this way that you can actually understand the reality of his nonviolence, which is an extraordinary one. So with that, I fear I've taken a great deal of your time, and I just want to end by thanking you again for your presence, and I look forward to the discussion that follows.